It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe Friday, December 6th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. Al Fresco, also in Los Angeles. I am John Ramey. We are going to discuss Georgia, the nation, not the college football team participating in the SEC championship game. We're going to talk about Syria and the civil war there that has boiled over, that has roots in the Arab Spring. We will talk about South Korea, where a botched attempt to declare martial law appears to be now leading to a possible impeachment vote, and the government collapse in France. So, busy week. Sam, the news business is a little bit like working in the hospitality business. Like if you're a bartender or a waiter, when it's really busy, the time flies by. You don't realize you're working. And I recall working in newsrooms when stories would pile up like this. It's kind of the same thing. So I don't mean to set the bar too high, but I'm looking forward to this episode very much because there's a lot to get to.
Yes, and you know, you can sort of reassure yourself that it's okay if you miss some things, right?
Right.
Because you can't possibly get to everything.
I mean, look, we're going to start with Georgia, but the Syrian conflict alone, I could spend a week trying to figure out who's who.
Absolutely, yeah. And you'd probably fail even then, right? I mean, there's so much, but by all means, let's just dive right in.
Okay, so reporting from the New York Times, thousands of Georgians demonstrated in front of their country's parliament for the fifth night in a row this past Monday, widening a political crisis that has set the country's pro-Russian government against those who want closer ties with the West. At the center of the clash is the announcement last week by governing Georgian Dream Party. Remember, we had covered that election in a previous episode.
Yes, not long ago.
Yeah, the country would put talks on European membership or about European membership on hold until 2028. The president, Salome Zorabishvili, who favors joining the EU, has encouraged the thousands who have taken to the streets nightly to protest the delay. The BBC reports more than 330 protesters have been arrested. And now opposition leaders have started to be targeted. That's also a BBC report.
Yes.
Nika Gvarmia, one of the four opposition groups, a leader of one of the four opposition groups, was carried by his arms and legs by police from his party headquarters in a side street next to Parliament in the capital, Tbilisi. Where to begin?
Well, it's difficult to say, but as you mentioned, we covered the elections there, I think just a month or so ago. And there were widespread and very credible allegations of fraud and vote buying and ballot stuffing and all this sort of thing. And even then, there were protests in the street. But as you mentioned, the really galvanizing event was the announcement that Georgia would suspend its application for membership of the European Union. And membership of the EU is a widely supported goal of the Georgian population. The polls put it up around 70%. And so even in the aftermath of the election, the president, Zorabishvili, very clearly sided with the protesters, and even more so now. The problem is, or a problem that is that the president is refusing to step down when her term ends next month. So this is sort of kind of doesn't come across as highly democratic in itself. But one of the sort of complicating factors of that analysis is that she was already going to be the last directly elected, president of Georgia, because there was a electoral reform passed a number of years ago in which now that there's going to be an electoral college, which will consist of the legislature and a bunch of the governors of all the states, including, by the way, the ones under Russian occupation since 2008. The Electoral College is going to be deciding who the next president is going to be. And I would imagine that they won't be seated until the elections are sorted out. So, uh,
So she kind of has the moral high ground, but kind of doesn't.
sort of, yeah. But she's got nothing to lose, is the point, right? I mean,
Sorry, I just want to break this. I want to get into this a little bit. So Zora Bishvili is not stepping down as president at the end of her term.
That's right.
And she is calling on people to continue their protests.
That's correct.
Attempting to speak for the will of the people.
Yes.
With the delay of the EU ascension or
Yes.
talks to join the EU. And she can claim the moral high ground even as she's not stepping down at the end of her term or intends to not step down at the end of her term because of this electoral reform, which is really pulling power away from the people by instituting an electoral college that will be more influenced by the Russians.
That's exactly right. All right. In other words, the presidency will be determined by strictly political actors instead of directly by the people in the future. But so, yeah, this is a very complicated situation. And the protests have not diminished at all. It's got to be very cold in Georgia right now. And it's difficult to see, though, how this situation is resolved. The government doesn't seem inclined to want to call new elections. And so I don't really, it's difficult for me anyway to see what sort of end game could possibly obtain here. But again, it would have to be difficult to see from this far away. And Georgia is a country that we don't necessarily hear about very often. And
it's not that big.
No, it's very small. It's kind of remote, we might say. It's on the very eastern end of the Black Sea.
Yeah,
right?
We'll throw the map up.
Yeah, and it doesn't figure in to a lot of important geopolitical conversations, although it does right now, simply because, or at least partly because, Georgia itself was sort of the kind of rehearsal stage for subsequent interference by Russia in Ukraine, which is, of course, now in the midst of a horrifying war and has been for 2.5 years, or almost 3 years.
Yeah, Georgia's 3.7 million people. So we're talking about something smaller than the city of Los Angeles in population.
That's right, but people there are very upset.
And they're right in the thick of it.
Yes,
just geographically.
That's right. And so this is something that we're going to need to keep an eye on. But again, I think that if I were the government, I would just sort of try to wait this out because there's not really, short of actually toppling the government, which would be a difficult thing to do since, they control the military and things like this. It's hard to see what other kind of outcome would be acceptable to the protesters.
Georgia, kind of dealt a rough hand by history.
Yes, I mean, in many ways. But
their most famous citizen or native son would be Joseph Stalin, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. But where this is something
that's tough to come back from.
Yeah, it certainly is. Well, Austria is doing fine after spawning Hitler, but they had Mozart. Anyway. Yeah. Well, but this is like many of the situations we're going to be talking about today. This is something that isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. And in fact, will probably take a lot longer to resolve than some of the other things we'll be talking about today.
All right. So if you thought that was complicated, you're just stretching before we get to the
appetizer.
The amuse-bouche. Okay. Syria. Al Jazeera reporting. Syrian anti-government forces say they have reached the edge of Homs. This is reporting from today, the 6th of December, Friday. Syrian anti-government forces say they have reached the edge of Homs hours after thousands of people began to flee the key city amid the opposition's lightning offensive. In a short statement published Friday, fighters led by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, remember that acronym, it's one of several you'll need to remember. A statement published by the HTS called on Syrian government forces to leave. quote, our forces have liberated the last village in the vicinity of the city of Homs, and they are now at the city's walls, end quote. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said earlier that thousands of Homs residents started fleeing overnight towards the western coast, where embattled Syrian President Bashar al-Assad still maintains control. Remember that name, Bashar al-Assad. A UK-based monitoring group said opposition fighters had captured two towns, Rastan and Talbissa, in the Homs Governorate, that's like the state or the province, before pushing further towards the city. Joshua Landis, a professor at the University of Oklahoma, which is not in Syria, said if the opposition takes control of Homs, it would cut the main highway that goes from Damascus to the coastal cities. And Professor Landis went on to tell Al Jazeera, quote, it would be a death knell, he believes, for the remaining possibility that the Syrian army could consolidate its powers and make a stand. So, wow.
Yes. And this is just a couple of days after the HTS forces took the city of Hama, which is just to the north of Homs, which we'll show on the map here. That was a big deal also, because the Syrian forces seem to have almost entirely melted away before even engaging with HTS.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. Let's just start on the 27th of November, which is when this boiled over.
That's right. We might have talked about this last week, but when we were talking about the Middle East, but it was just starting to heat up.
Just coming to a simmer. Yeah,
that's right. And so in some ways, it's better that we waited a week to talk about it now.
Okay. Before we dive into some of the factions here, we just want to point out that according to various sources, 370,000 people have been displaced by what has taken place since November 27th. About 100 civilians have been killed. And military death estimates I'm seeing range between 500 and 1,500. Okay. So this started on the 27th of November. This is Wikipedia now. A coalition of Syrian opposition groups called Military Operations Command, led by the HTS and allied Turkish-backed groups in the Syrian National Army, the SNA, launched an offensive, and this is confusing. The Syrian National Army is fighting against government forces.
That's right. They're not the government army.
The Syrian National Army is part of the rebel coalition.
Exactly.
Launched an offensive against the pro-government Syrian Arab Army. So SNA, rebels. SAA, pro-government. They launched this offensive against the SAA in Idlib, Aleppo, and Hama in Syria. This operation was codenamed Deterrence of Aggression, blah, blah, blah. And this is the first time that opposition forces in the Syrian civil war launched a military offensive campaign since March of 2020's ceasefire in Idlib. So it had been a minute since this civil war had this kind of intensity.
Yes.
And Sam, I am ashamed to admit, I was listening to the Intelligencer podcast from The Economist, which I would recommend everybody who enjoys this podcast should check out.
I would also.
And the Syrian civil war has been going on for so long, and it's just like such a thing that I happen to kind of know exists. I had forgotten, and it makes sense that it does. It goes all the way back to the Arab Spring.
That's right. Yes.
I had totally forgotten that.
Yes.
It's been going on that long, A. And B, yeah, Assad is a tyrant, and he didn't like any of that protest nonsense.
Certainly not. And he's certainly committed war crimes against his own people in the interim, as did his father, by the way, the previous Syrian dictator.
Right. Assad was also his surname.
Hafiz al-Assad was his name, yeah.
I mean, there's there's like a Kurdish element, there's a Turkish element, but that seems a bit in the weeds for our purposes today.
Well, I mean, Turkey they're not quite the patron of HTS, but they do fund them, right? If HTS is affiliated with any foreign power, it would be Turkey. But that would be a pretty loose affiliation, I would say.
Speaking of affiliations, we forgot to mention that Russia backs Assad.
Well, yes. And going back to the early days of the Civil War, things looked very bad for Assad until the intervention of the Russians about 10 years ago. And it was them who really turned the tide of the war in favor of Assad to the point where people generally thought that Assad had essentially won. The war was still ongoing. I think it's important to remember that fighting was still taking place all the time, but only on a very low level. It's really in the past week that this situation has just escalated the conflict in Syria to a great degree. And if you look again at the map, Russia has an air base and a naval base along the Mediterranean coast. So it's the taking of Homs just now, apparently, that will cut off Russian forces from the interior of Syria as a whole. And that's really the strategic calculus that has people forecasting the imminent collapse of the regime, which might happen, might not. It should be pointed out also that the Russians have never had more than a few thousand actual troops there. They've been helping Assad mainly through air power.
Okay, so this isn't a circumstance where suddenly Russia pulled tens of thousands of bodies out of Syria to help with the Ukrainian effort.
No one believes that they've had any more than 5,000 troops there at any time since the beginning of the conflict. So
that's not that many boots on the ground.
No, it really isn't. And so, I mean, they shouldn't have to take any of them away. 5,000 people isn't going to make any difference in Ukraine, where they're routinely dumping thousands and thousands and thousands of troops into Ukraine, right? That's not going to really make any difference to them. The other factor, though, is, of course, Hezbollah, right? Who, like Bashar al-Assad, are clients of Iran. Assad's particular religious background is as an Alawite Muslim, which is not exactly the same as being a Shia Muslim, but it's similar, right?
It's not Sunni enough to count, right?
Exactly.
It's
right?
sufficiently not Sunni.
That's right. And they share certain theological precepts with the Shia, but that's a topic for somebody else's podcast. And so Hezbollah has always been allied with Assad ever since the war broke out, not just because they share patronage of Iran. But Hezbollah definitely can't spare anybody right now. They've got a lot of problems, as we've discussed many times on this podcast. Their leadership has been decimated by Israel. So it's not, and they haven't moved any troops out of Syria either, by the way, although you might have thought they would, but they so far haven't done so. But the point is, neither they nor the Russians are probably going to move a lot more assets in, or at least I'm very confident that Hezbollah won't, just because it would be much too difficult for them and put their other positions at risk. I guess maybe Russia might try to redeploy there, but I kind of doubt it. But I think that's the general idea, is that there's very little chance of Assad gaining extra support from the people who've been helping him out so far, including Iran directly, by the way, because they're, again, in the ongoing conflict with Israel, they've just been handed defeat after defeat. Having said that, there have been some movements of militia personnel from Iraq, that is Shia militia, who are also aligned with Iran. They've been moving in some numbers, not very large, but some numbers of them have been moving across the border to try and help out. However, I just heard literally 5 minutes ago that other Syrian rebel forces who are not at all affiliated with HTS, and in fact, are in some cases hostile to them, are just sort of taking advantage of this particular situation that's been unfolded in the past week to also try to expand their activities against the regime. People like the Kurds in the north. And
is that just because this is an extraordinarily, apparently weak moment for Assad?
Exactly. Right. And so, these,
who nobody likes and nobody liked his dad, and they're terrible.
that's right. And
Yeah,
so, but the problem that people in the West have is that there aren't really any good guys here. We
sure.
have some, but the United States has some affiliations with some small militia in the eastern part of the country, but that's really mainly to keep an eye on Islamic State and to make sure there's no sort of resurgence of Islamic State in the eastern part of Syria and the western part of Iraq.
Because and please correct me if I'm being prejudicial here, but if you have a militia in this part of the world that has skin in the game in the Syrian civil war, you're not too far from being something like a jihadi, right?
That's right. And
Many of them.
Most of them, I would say, are, except perhaps
Yeah.
some of the Kurdish militia, right? They're
Sure.
they're more of a sort of old-fashioned
And those
ethnic
are the ones the U.S.
separatist.
backs, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
to much to the consternation of our NATO ally Turkey, right, who considers
Right.
them an anti-Turkish terrorist group because, in fact, their Kurdish brethren inside Turkey have, on occasion, committed terrorist acts against the Turkish state. So this is an all extraordinarily complicated stew of events.
As we're considering the latest chapter in the Syrian civil war, I'm now kind of back spooling the past 25 years of the 21st century, and I'm like, all right, so in Syria, let's just call the roll here, okay? You've got the Arab Spring, that I guess that's the high watermark where it crests, and the crackdown, Assad, or the civil war, the violence, right?
Yes.
The Arab Spring was it peaceful till it got there?
If I remember correctly, I believe Gaddafi had already been overthrown in Libya.
Okay.
I think that's right.
Okay. But like, it's the Arab Spring certainly reaches an intensity with the precipitating the outbreak of this civil war. That civil war in Syria, okay, Arab Springs, 2011, right? So the Syrian civil war involves Russia, as you mentioned, involves Hezbollah and therefore Iran, as you mentioned, is so destabilizing it exacerbates or maybe is the primary root cause of the great wave of migrants that precipitate the crisis that lead to Brexit.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Although there were also a lot of Afghan migrants that contributed to that particular issue, right?
Okay.
We shouldn't discount that as
fair
a
enough. But maybe the Syrian civil war seems to touch a lot of things in a way that nothing outside of the global war on terror and then those bungled policies by the United States. It's all there. It's all there. Sorry. Yeah. Get your earpiece back on.
It certainly is.
I'm being very, very astute here, Sam. You won't want to miss this.
I know.
No, but it just, again, I hadn't reflected on the Syrian civil war since we began this podcast. Really,
that's right. And we should
it's all there.
We should recall also that Syria shares a land border to its north with Turkey, which is just one nation over from Europe, right? So it's much easier to get to Europe if you're Syrian than if you're an Afghan, right? Also, many of the people who fled Syria were people of means, right? They had something like a thriving middle class there for many years, right? So many people who went from Syria to Europe just got on a plane, right? They weren't sort of, swimming across
it's not boat people.
No, and many of them did this, and so the Syrian conflict has been a very large contributor to the wave of migration to Europe in particular. But many people try to get to Europe from all over the Eastern Hemisphere, so it's not all that surprising.
Again, John rediscovers the relevance of the Syrian civil war. I mean, we could probably finish the episode on that. Do we have any more non-navel gazing thoughts about this?
Again, this could go on for quite some time, or if the rebel offensive by HTS continues at its current pace, Syria could fall by the time we record next week's episode. I kind of
Sure.
doubt that's going to happen, but we can't rule it out. Again, we're going to have to return to this in future episodes.
Oh, sorry. I have one more question.
Okay.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like to hear you express this. Why does Russia care about anything that happens in Syria?
Russia cares, and this has been true for a long time. Their naval base in, I can't remember if it's Latakia or Tartus, but in the small Mediterranean coastline of Syria, is their only warm water port in the world. And it's certainly their only port in the Mediterranean. It's really just strategic power projection for them. Now, of course, it helps them also to feel like and be able to say that they have influence in the Middle East, which is always considered to be a geopolitically important region. And I think it probably will be for some time to come. And so it's just kind of, it's obviously more than bragging rights, but it's something that's important to them, right?
It's prestige adjacent with some actual strategic consideration.
That's right. I mean, apart from that, if they're just sort of hemmed inside the Black Sea, right, it doesn't make them look very strong. It helps them feel like a more important world power, which, as we know, is something that's just very important to Vladimir Putin.
To the South Korean botched attempt at martial law.
Sure.
Reporting from NPR, that is National Public Radio. Enjoy it while it lasts. Dateline Seoul, as new details emerged today about the failed attempt by South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol to impose martial law earlier this week, calls for his impeachment have strengthened. Parliament is expected to vote Saturday, that is tomorrow, on an impeachment measure, and large street demonstrations are expected. On December 3rd, 2024, this is Reuters, South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law for the first time since 1980. Within hours, chaos began to unfold as police scuffled with protesters and soldiers flew in on military helicopters to storm the National Assembly compound in Seoul. In just a few frantic hours, lawmakers were forced to climb the walls into the National Assembly compound in order to lift the martial law decree after being blocked by military troops and police. What the hell is going on in South Korea? Nominally like a robust democracy. Why on earth would President Yoon Suk Yeol just apparently whimsically declare martial law?
Well, I mean, it's a long story, but we might say that
it ought to be, because it's a weird thing to do.
Yeah, that President Yoon, I think, was one of the first beneficiaries of the anti-incumbent wave sparked by the massive global inflation. He took office in 2022 when inflation was much worse than it is now, and he only won by half a point. He got 50.5% of the popular vote in that election. And South Korean presidents only get one 5-year term. And in a way, still being the incumbent has hurt him. In other words, that same anti-incumbency wave helped him get elected and then helped the opposition party just get enormous gains in the legislature just 2 years later, which was an election we covered earlier this year. And so also Yoon, before being president, was the public prosecutor and in fact had prosecuted essentially his own elected boss, the justice minister, for corruption, which is rife in South Korea. But this helped him gain a lot of electoral support in the amongst the conservative backers of the People Power Party, which is the main conservative party in South Korea.
Which again is so ironic, just in tone.
Well, but again, it's more unusual to you than
that's my provincialism.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But Yoon, because he had only ever been a prosecutor, had no legislative experience whatsoever. And so
Ah,
he have had real problems trying to get anything done. And of course, his popular vote margin in the election was very small. So even before the opposition took the legislature back, they had enough support that they could kind of stand in his way, as an opposition legislature always does. Yoon seemed to have real problems coming to grips with this idea.
evidently. Maybe
Yes.
he should have declared martial law sooner.
Well, I mean, the
I
problem,
mean, from his perspective.
sure, but once the Democratic Party, which is the name of the center left party, got the legislature back, he found it almost impossible to do anything. And in fact, the South Korean constitution allows for the declaration of martial law. There are procedures that you have to follow to do it, but it's not something that is unheard of, especially since the Korean War is officially still on, right? I mean, it was
Right.
just a ceasefire.
Right. I
So
guess sure.
if you're still
Yeah.
in a state of war with your nuclear armed neighbor, you actually, having the ability to declare martial law in your constitution isn't so outlandish as it would seem to be here,
I'm
right?
glad you raised that because it just seemed outlandish.
Yeah, but it still is. Okay, everybody in South Korea was like, "What is going on?" I saw an interview with just a regular South Korean person, right, who lives about 40 miles outside of Seoul. Right, and it's now keep in mind that also President Yoon did this at 10:30 p.m. Korea time, right, and so all these people who civilians who just went to the legislature to try and stop him, a lot of them probably had to get dressed. All right. So this one guy who lives outside of Seoul, he gets in his car, drives 40 miles to make sure he can take part in whatever civilian resistance there's going to be to this almost unprecedented event. A lot of these people would sort of formed human pyramids so that the legislatures could climb the walls, as you said before. They enough of them managed to get inside the National Assembly compound to form a quorum in the legislature and vote unanimously to overturn martial law. Which again, that you can do that under the Constitution. The president is allowed to declare martial law. The legislature is allowed to overturn it with as long as they can convene a quorum. Unfortunately, part of the martial law declaration just suspended all political activity. So essentially, Yoon says, I'm declaring martial law. Lots of legislators, including some from his own party, by the way. The vote was 190-0. I think it was 18 of those people who voted unanimously to overturn martial law were members of Yoon's own party, whom he didn't tell that he was going to do this. And so a lot of people are saying, a lot of South Koreans, mind you, are saying, this was our January 6th. And if Yoon is actually impeached and removed from office tomorrow, I would have to say that their January 6th turned out better than ours. The
Yeah.
democratic system
Consequences.
they were levied against this action immediately, and with overwhelming public support. People,
Sam, how many legislators in the United States can even scale a wall in our
That's right.
gerontocracy?
Honestly, looking at
I'm impressed by that,
well, the thing is,
by the South Koreans.
There's a lot of South Korean legislators who look remarkably young.
I was going to say, this is a physically robust legislative branch, apparently.
Yeah, but South Korea is actually an elderly society, so I found that's kind of odd. But we're running out of time to talk about this, unfortunately.
I know, sorry.
But that's okay. One of the even when impeachment proceedings were mooted earlier this week, one of the people in the People's Power Party didn't seem to want to fully go for impeachment just because they thought it would be bad for them politically. And again, martial law was also bad for them politically, but they didn't want to add to it. Okay. So that changed today when the legislative head of the People Power Party, a fellow named Han Dong-hu, he had seen evidence that President Yoon, in declaring martial law, intended to imprison or at least detain opposition legislators and others, including including Han himself, who was the leader in the legislature of Yoon's own party.
He saw evidence of this, like Yoon had written a memo ready to go after.
There's been a lot of legislative testimony ever since.
Bad look.
Ongoing, right? Legislators are sleeping inside the National Assembly Hall in case Yoon tries to declare martial law again, right? Which people don't really think he's going to do, but he could still do it. Yeah. And so by the time we get up tomorrow, we'll know if he's been impeached or not, probably anyway. So again, we'll have to return to this story. But I think it's important to point out that in trying to justify the martial law declaration, Yoon said that there were pro-North Korean anti-state forces at work inside South Korea trying to undermine the fabric of the
nation. Do we believe that?
No, nobody believes it. It's ridiculous, right? But this is what every autocrat is doing. You'll recall Donald Trump talked about Marxists and communists and stuff like this. Putin talks about Nazis, right? It's always some nefarious group trying to do us in, right? It's always garbage, but for some reason, this is the playbook that everybody thinks they can follow.
Very quickly, to France, and this is just me saying this. There's no evidence of this, but I bet Emmanuel Macron would declare martial law right now if he could, because his prime minister, or their prime minister, Michel Barnier, just got a no confidence vote. So the government has collapsed. It's the quickest a government has collapsed in the history of the Fifth Republic.
That's right. Michel Barnier is the shortest serving prime minister in the history of the Fifth Republic. Maybe we should try for number 6.
Yeah. What's French for Liz? What's French for Liz Truss?
Yeah, it's a terrible situation. But Macron says he'll be naming a new prime minister in the coming days. So perhaps,
and Macron's not going to resign. He also said
he's not going to resign. And so by the time we record next week, we'll probably know who he thinks the new prime minister is going to be. We'll see.
See, Sam, I bet you didn't know that reporting the news was like being a bartender, but now you do.
Well, I've suspected that there might be some similarities. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. All right. That'll do it for us. We'll be back next Friday. He's Sam. I'm John. Peace.
Thanks, everybody.